and welcome to the GSC Grays podcast. Today we are joined by farm business consultant Jake Nixon as we discuss whether farmers should be extensifying their farming enterprise or intensifying. Now we'll get into the definitions of that in just a moment with Jake. This podcast is for farmers, their advisors, and anyone with an interest in agriculture. GSC Grays have our farm business advice service that's funded through DEFRA's Future Farm Resilience Fund. We've seen nearly 1,000 farmers across the north of England, and the ambition of this podcast is to share some of the learnings and the trends that we're seeing across the north. So without further ado, let's welcome Jake. Thank you for joining us today. And I'll just kick off by asking you how you became interested in agriculture and your ambition to be a farm business consultant.
So I suppose my introduction to farming was fairly typical. I grew up on a small family farm, kind of worked with sheep, beef, cattle, arable cropping, bit of wine production briefly.
Wine production.
And then more latterly dairy, and that's really where I've come into. Then when I came into work at GSC Grays as a farm business consultant, I suppose that was really for my interest for the business side of farming, and actually looking at it from through the numbers through a spreadsheet and looking at farming business in a slightly different way to what you normally see just from speaking to those people involved.
And we had quite an interesting discussion just before we started recording around the differences between a farm business consultant, an accountant, and perhaps like a kind of technical specialist. I don't know if you're happy to just sort of briefly go through that for those who are listening who might not quite understand the role that our teams play when they go out on farm.
Yeah, so I think the main difference between us as farm business consultants and accountants is we tend to all come from a practical farming background. Whether that was 40 years ago or 5 years ago, we've all had that practical experience. So it gives us a greater understanding of the natural cycles that govern farm businesses, which sometimes you find other business professionals don't have that background, struggle to understand or don't quite appreciate to start with, which then means that they don't particularly well understand the mechanisms of farm businesses. It's not as simple as making a decision today and it taking effect tomorrow. The decisions we help clients make could take 6 months to come to fruition. It could take 3 or 4 years. And I think that's really the key difference between our role and what a client would get from their accountant. Exactly.
Perfect. Thank you very much. So our discussion today is around whether farmers should extensify or intensify. Now, quite keen to sort of get into what we mean by that, but just I wanted to first of all talk about why we're discussing those two terms. Now, we're coming across a lot of farmers who are at a bit of a crossroads, aren't they? Having to make decisions because of the phase out of the BPS. Now, extensification, what do we mean by that?
So extensification is typically trying to reduce the inputs you're putting into your farming system. And that generally also means that you reduce the yield, whether that's tons of wheat or kilos of lamb or litres of milk. And the hope is that you reduce the costs by a greater proportion than you reduce the output.
Okay.
Therefore giving a greater margin per unit of output and hoping to maintain profitability.
That's a really lovely, neat definition of that. Okay, so that's extensification. And then I suppose on the other side of the coin, intensification. So again, that's got quite a, can be quite a controversial term, but I think it definitely has a practical application on farm when we're looking at different farming practices. So again, what do we mean when we're talking about intensification?
So intensification would be obviously the opposite. And what you're seeking to do is really get the most out of what is often the key resource for any farming business, which is land. And trying to maximise output from a given land area, which could be for some businesses down to a matter of a few acres. If you look at some poultry and pig businesses, they are just buildings on a site and with no actually supporting land. And what they're looking to do is maximise the output, which generally comes with a degree of increased cost, leading to a reduced margin. But again, the hope with that opposite to extensification, is that the increase in output outweighs the increase in cost. So you get more smaller margins to increase profitability rather than fewer larger margins.
And that can apply across all sectors. It's not just the ones that are traditionally associated with.
Yeah, that's a really important thing, I think, to consider when talking about this. Is all farming systems fall somewhere on a spectrum. You'll find, I mean, there are sectors that are, like you say, more typically associated with intensive farming, which has a bad rap, and then you'll find that some of those sectors, actually, you could find that, take a dairy unit, for example, an organic dairy unit is probably more extensive or is more extensive than an intensive beef finishing unit. So actually you do get crossover quite a lot. So it's not as clear cut as those are intensive, those are extensive. There's a massive variance between different systems and even between different businesses practicing the same system.
Okay, that's really interesting. Thank you, Jake. Okay, so I explained briefly why it's relevant, and I guess I just wanted you to sort of have a bit of a discussion around that. What sort of questions are we getting from farmers? I explained in the introduction, we've seen a large number of farmers across the north going through this pivotal change, the biggest change in a generation. And is this a topic that's coming up a lot when you're speaking to farmers?
Yeah, I think it's driving a huge amount of change and reflection in the industry more widely. This is the biggest change really since the end of the First World War, when the government started to introduce subsidies to maximise food production, and that's where it comes back to. And so we have over 100 years of fairly consistent government policy with regard to food production, and that has changed. And it happens to have changed at exactly the same time we've had enormous volatility, which has compounded the pressures on farming businesses, and it's really driving up, like I say, an awful lot of reflection. How do we make our farm businesses that were fit for the last 100 years fit for the next?
Yeah.
And I think for many businesses, actually taking that head on and really assessing with kind of an open mind, blue sky thinking, that's an enormous opportunity for businesses that actually might not have done so well previously, to go back to the drawing board. How can we actually set this business up for the next 50 years?
Yeah. Okay. So I really like that it's a opportunistic, future-looking view, because I think a lot of people are finding the transition quite hard, but it can be, with the right mindset and, sort of looking at the figures in the right way, it can be an exciting opportunity looking forward, can't it? So no, that's really kind of exciting to hear. So do you have any kind of good examples of what a really good intensive farming system would look like from our perspective? And I don't know if you could give an example of a couple of different sectors. For those who are listening, Jake has a particular passion for dairy, so there'll definitely be a dairy example in there.
I think there's 3.
Okay, brilliant. If you could talk us through, where farmers are doing a really good job and it's sort of, profitable, they're enjoying success, etc.
So I suppose the last 3 or 4 years has been an incredibly difficult period for intensive businesses. They tend to be more closely linked to commodity prices. And with the impact of the war in Ukraine, conflict in the Middle East, and all that kind of thing, financial issues closer to home, that has caused real significant pressure on those businesses. And I think where we've got clients in the more intensive sectors that have performed really well is actually where that intensive enterprise is part of a wider mix.
Yeah.
So I mean, a couple that come to mind, we've got a broiler producer. They have about 300,000 broiler places, so fairly average sized broiler unit. That's supported by, I think it's 600-700 acres of arable cropping, renewable energies. They've got solar park and commercial lets. Another example, a bit closer over this side of the country, completely different end of the scale, about 50-60 acre farm, and that's a young farmer. He's got 16,000 hens, a couple of thousand B&B pigs, and a beef finishing enterprise. And what we found over the last 3 years is each one of those enterprises has had a particularly difficult year.
Right.
But in each of those 3 years, the other two enterprises have propped it up. So it's spread the risk and removed the dependency solely on egg price or pig price or beef price.
Okay.
So yeah, I think where we've seen they've actually performed really well is part of a wider mix.
Right. Okay. So intensification doesn't have to mean one sector. It
No.
can, you can still kind of be spreading your eggs in different baskets to make sure that they're, you're seen through the peaks and troughs.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, people do tend to associate intensification with specialisation, and that has happened to a great degree over the last 50 years. People have gone into, we're just going to be pig farmers, or we're just going to be producing chicken, or we're just going to produce milk. But like I say, I think where businesses have performed particularly well in difficult times is where they've had other enterprises to support them.
Okay.
Because intensive sectors or intensive enterprises are very cyclical. They do all go through, whether it's a 3-year cycle or a 7-year cycle or a 15-year cycle, they will all go through the same pattern over and over again. I think your profitability is almost made in the bad years rather than the good ones. Actually, how little can we lose in a bad year? And then you make it up in the good year.
In the good years, yeah.
And
so other than their diverse portfolio, you mentioned 2 businesses there. What else are they doing that means that they are, kind of like a successful example of intensification?
I mean, I think one of the key things with any intensive enterprise is attention to detail. And that's not just out in the farmyard, but actually back in the office and making sure that there is enough money coming in. If there isn't, and you can foresee that, what can we do about it? And it's much more management intensive from the business side, and managing people as well, because although they might have a requirement for fewer people per unit of output, they tend to still need a lot more people. And actually, it's being able to source the quality labour and keep them happy, and manage them in a way that people take ownership of their element of running the business, rather than it just being a 9 to 5. Well, it's never a 9 to 5, but rather than just being a day job.
So farmers that are potentially look at that crossroads, looking at which direction to travel, if they're really excited by the thought of being very hands-on and sort of, actively managing, a sort of a bigger outfit, they should perhaps be thinking more along the intensification route.
Yes, but I think how your definition of management changes in those circumstances, where the really well-performing intensive enterprises, actually, the person who owns it or runs it isn't necessarily going in every day and doing the manual jobs. They're realising where the value of their time is best spent, which is generally taking a step back, finding suitably qualified or suitably experienced other people to manage those more manual tasks, and then taking a step back and looking at the wider picture, and managing the business, like I say, from the office in many cases. Obviously, they still need to be aware of what's happening on the ground day to day, but actually some of those best performing businesses, people do take a slight step back from the hands-on.
Okay. And you mentioned then that it requires a lot of inputs, skilled people. I can already see before I even ask the question, sort of what are the pitfalls of going down more of an intensive route?
Yeah, so as you say, first thing is finding the right people. And that's becoming increasingly difficult across agriculture as a whole. Particularly in some of those more intensive sectors, you tend to find that there can be, in many cases, in more kind of urban fringe areas, and then you have increased competition for other industries. If I can drive a tractor or I can drive a lorry, well, if a haulage firm's going to pay you £60,000 to sit and drive a lorry, farmers are going to struggle to compete with that, with the returns as they are at the moment, and we're seeing that quite a lot with clients.
Okay, that's a big problem. And what about then, so that it takes a lot more sort of investment, cash flow, high risk, high reward. So I take it this, that's perhaps an issue then for farmers looking at perhaps intensifying their businesses as well.
Yeah, so you're exactly right. Intensive businesses are higher risk. You get it much better in the good years, and you get it much harder in the bad years. And they do require an awful lot of investment generally into poultry sheds, pig sheds, dairy units. You start talking in millions rather than hundreds of thousands or tens of thousands.
Goodness, yeah.
And what that does is it then lifts the profit requirement of that business, because there'll be so much capital expenditure each year which has to be made to maintain an effective and efficient business. And that's where you have to grow the pie, because the bank will take some and the taxman will take some.
Yeah.
So you've got to make sure that the pie is big enough to be able to feed all the mouths that will want to eat from it.
Okay. On the other side of the coin then, we've got extensification and extensive systems. We've already sort of defined that. So again, could you give us some examples potentially of some really good quality farmers who are doing extensification particularly well?
Yes, I mean, one which has made quite a significant change to their business in the last 3-4 years. They were really ahead of the curve in realising the change that was going to come, and making changes to maximise the benefits of it. As a hill farmer we work with over in the North York Moors, they're primarily a sheep business, and they had I think a small beef enterprise. And what they did, and it was a very intensive business for an upland farm. They're bringing in a lot of feed.
Intensive upland farm. Well, that's interesting.
But that's what I talk about, the spectrum. All extensive isn't woolly cows on hilltops,
Well,
and all intensive isn't kind of pristine laboratory sheds.
Yeah.
There is a massive range in between and a lot of crossover,
Okay.
more than the kind of typical consumer would realise. And yeah, so this fella, he realised the scale of change that was going to happen. He thought, we've got to do something about it. The business was highly dependent on basic payment for profitability at the end of the year. So what they've done is they've reduced sheep numbers to levels that they can sustain more easily on the ground they've got available. It's turned much more to a forage-based system. So a lot of herbal lays. They've introduced a small area of arable cropping, actually. So they're growing their own straw. They're growing a small amount of feed barley for finishing lambs.
Right.
And that spring cropping couples with the ability to grow a forage crop. So they've looked at maximising what they can produce from the land resources they have, and tweaking that to suit their particular conditions, their climate. And interestingly, actually, more recently, they have introduced a more intensive beef finishing enterprise.
Right.
But that has formed part of the mix, but it's still part of a wider extensification of the farming system.
So it doesn't have to be either or, it can be both.
No, and it comes back to that spectrum. And part of that is, in addition to the production changes he's made use of funding available under countryside stewardship.
Perfect. So he's able to integrate schemes and look at opportunities that way.
He's gone a step further with the introduction of SFI, and there's an SFI agreement starting there very soon to kind of take that the next step.
So then, do the words sort of self-sufficient and sort of looking at kind of being able to keep everything in house, is that a key part of extensive systems?
That's definitely, I think that's one of the main drivers. The more inputs you have, the more risk you have, because generally those inputs are commodities. So they're not dictated often by what happens here in the UK, but they're dictated by what happens on a wider world market, which we have no control over.
Yeah. Which we've clearly seen.
Which we've seen very clearly over the last 3 years. And on a good year, the good years won't be as good. You won't get the record profits. But at the same time, in the bad years, they shouldn't be as bad. And it's about, with farming, it's about being sufficiently profitable more often than not. You're always, no matter what system, we're working with nature. Nature doesn't follow the same patterns. It's not standardised. So it's about maximising the number of good years you have and trying to get an average.
Okay.
And maintain that average sufficiently to provide for the people involved and allow for that business to continue to develop and reinvest and maintain itself.
Okay. So it's all about kind of managing risk.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay. And then I don't know if you had any more sort of examples, but sounds like there's very few downsides, but again, what are the pitfalls of going to an extensive system? It almost sounds like scaling back as well, perhaps, or is that a misconception again?
I mean, it depends on exactly how you approach it. Like I say, there's a whole range of things that you could do under extensification. I mean, another good example, a client of mine, they're organic dairy farmers, and they're producing commodity organic. It's organic milk, but still it's a milk. It's a commodity, and in the last couple of years, when the conventional dairy sector had a really high point year, back in 2022. That was a very difficult time for organic milk producers.
Right.
And coupled with lockdown as things were going on, the kind of tail off of COVID, what they actually looked to do is they've diversified their business and they've gone into milk vending, which has proven they already had a slight dairy processing element to their business, but they've expanded that. And that's just absolutely taken off. And that's probably in the space of 2.5 to 3 years, that has become almost an equal part of the business to the production side.
Right.
And now what we're looking at doing is they want to maximise the benefit to the business of that. And it's the only dairy farmer I've ever spoken to who said, I want to keep fewer cows.
Right, okay.
So what they're actually looking to do is reduce the herd slightly by about 20%, basically to give them time to do the work for their dairy processing.
Right.
And they also want to improve their work-life balance. So they don't want to be slogging on from 5 o'clock in the morning to 9 o'clock at night, doing all the farm work, and then making their cheeses, their creams, their yogurts, their milkshakes.
Yeah, gosh, that sounds crazy.
So that's, I suppose, part of a more holistic look on the business. There happens to be succession happening in that business as well, and it's really a brilliant case of it was set up so that when that stage was reached, the business would have a clean slate and the next generation could more or less do what they wanted. If they wanted to go more intensive and increase the size of the farm, increase the herd size, they could do, but equally if they wanted to go the other way, which is kind of what we're looking at doing now, that opportunity was available to them. And it will take, I suppose that's maybe a form of extensification that people wouldn't necessarily think of, because it is coupled with a diversification.
Yes.
But that business is setting itself up for the next 10 years, 15 years, 20 years.
Yeah, because that's one thing through the Farm Business Advice Service is that we're seeing that it's bringing forward that conversation around succession, and it's wonderful to hear some of these amazing success stories where both generations are working together, bringing in innovative enterprises and having those discussions and creating a business that's sustainable for the future and can support, kind of both parties as well, which is really good to hear.
Yeah. I think it's really important that people have that open and honest discussion. Obviously, there's normally personalities to manage. If people get on well, they're more likely to do it. If they don't, I suppose it's equally important then. People need to, if it's happening in the next 5 or 10 years, people probably need to know where they stand, whether that's going to be a positive for them or not so positive. Actually ensuring that a business continues, if that's the intentions of the people involved. It's really important to know, so the next generation know whether we have something to go to or we don't.
Yeah.
Or what do we have to go to?
Absolutely.
If there's debts overhanging that have been carried on, that can then have a really limiting effect on those people's ability to make the necessary changes in a business. So having that understanding and having that really clear and frank discussion, I think, is a really important thing to do, particularly at this point of change within the industry.
Absolutely. And it's a key topic, and it's something that we'll actually be discussing in the next episode of the podcast with Guy. So no, it is. It's a really, really interesting one. So pitfalls for extensification. Doesn't sound like there are many, but there must be.
It's got to be, as with any change in a farming business, it has to be managed. You cannot just say, right, I'm going to take an arable situation, I'm going to start direct drilling next year and just go on that tangent.
Yeah.
You've got to think, any change to a business is going to take 2 or 3 years to actually happen, and then the business reaches a normalised position. And particularly if you are going to do something that reduces the output, you've got to make sure that the costs are managed and that there's going to be sufficient cash flow through that change. If you're looking at kind of beef systems, if you're changing where your replacements are coming from, or you're changing your breeding stock or your breeding herd or anything like that, those changes could take 24, 26 months to actually come to fruition. And the real dangerous thing is not understanding the implications for cash flow in that period.
Yeah, so actually getting to grips with the numbers, being comfortable with where you are and where you need to be moving forward, and making sure that you've got some funds to kind of see you through that change. And it's a change of mindset as well, as much as anything else.
Yeah, and like we said earlier, this is the biggest change. There's a whole generation of farmers that have been brought up and have lived their lives with the mantra that the way to be profitable is to maximise production. And like I say, that's a result of government policy for the last 100 years plus. The world has changed. It's changing still. Government policy has clearly changed. And actually, farmers will need to change in some way to be able to continue operating in a new world. And I think in the long term, it will leave farmers better off. And like I say, I think those that look at it proactively, see the opportunities, work out whether it's for them, and get on with it, will be those that get the benefit. And those that, unfortunately, as with any change that we've ever had in farm subsidy, those that get left behind tend to be those that are no longer farming in 5 or 10 years. So particularly if there's another generation to come into it, it's really important to take a really hard look at the business and go into the minutiae. Don't be shy to share if there's issues.
Yeah.
Because that's then first step to solving a problem is realising there is one.
Absolutely.
And you can't, if you bury your head in the sand, nothing will change. And it's normally, by the time you do realise there has to be change, it's quite often too late.
It's too late. Okay. Well, hopefully we'll, through the scheme and that ourselves and others are delivering, we'll be able to start them on that journey. So I would imagine then, with everything that's been going on, that really the preferred option for a lot of farmers, particularly considering the age demographic, has been to go down the extensive route. Now, what does that mean for food production, Jake?
Now, this is quite an interesting thing that has come to, I suppose, the front of people's minds quite recently, particularly when you look at the things like the introduction of the Sustainable Farming Scheme or the consultation around that in Wales. There's been protests out there.
Yeah, people are concerned.
There's major concerns, and I think quite often people confuse food production with self-sufficiency.
Right.
They're normally seen as synonymous, and they're not. There's actually, our self-sufficiency hasn't improved despite our food output having increased quite significantly.
Okay.
Just I suppose looking at the wider picture, I think it's about 22% of food consumed in the UK is actually wasted. It never gets eaten.
It's a terrifying statistic, isn't it?
And it's a third globally. So actually, if the way to maximise food self-sufficiency, it's not really with farmers. It's got to be a wider system change, which we can't tackle that in an hour.
It starts with the consumer, doesn't it?
It starts with consumers, it starts with government, and it has to involve farmers. But actually, if the goal is to increase self-sufficiency, it is a wider picture issue than solely what is actually happening on farm.
Okay, but extensive systems do tend to result in a lesser rate of production.
In most cases, you'll find certain things like beef production where they're introducing rotational grazing, mob grazing, herbal lays. Actually, the output and the carrying capacity of those farms can increase.
Okay.
I've had some, it's up to doubled. So it's not in every case, but generally, yes, you would see a reduced level of output. But again, back to the self-sufficiency point, it's also about what are we producing, because there's certain things where we produce way more than we actually consume as a country. So, we're massively down on fruit and vegetable production, yet I think we're a net exporter of wheat and other more commodity type products like that. So actually, as part of a wider system change, it's almost should be part of the agricultural transition.
Indeed,
it needs to be looking at putting increasing production in areas that need it and where we fall really short.
Actually, sort of top-down approach, looking at what the country would require to be self-sufficient, and then helping farmers to address that need.
Yeah. And some of that will involve intensification.
Yes.
Like I'm primarily a stock-focused consultant, but you see the glass houses coming up on Teesside, growing tomatoes and cucumbers. That is a form of intensive farming, really.
Yeah.
But it's sustainable intensification, which is another element to this. Actually, if intensification is required, how do they do it in a way that is environmentally and socially sustainable?
Absolutely.
Intensive farming does have a bit of a bad rap with the consumer. So where it does have to happen, you do have to bring people along with you. And the glass houses on Teesside, they're using waste heat from industry. So first of all, that insulates those businesses from commodity energy costs because they're taking a waste product. And secondly, it's producing an awful lot of food that otherwise we probably wouldn't be growing in the UK.
Absolutely. It's doing things in the right way for the right reasons.
I mean, another really good example of that, there was a presentation done at Dairy Tech earlier in the year by a farm manager from an estate farming business. I mean, it's an enormous, they farm about just over 2,000 hectares.
Goodness.
They've got 2,500 dairy cows. So for the 99% of people, I think, would say that's an intensive farming business.
Yeah.
But it was a really, really interesting presentation. So they practice what's called really a circular farming system. So they're producing milk and cereals. And so what they do is, rather than feeding all the cereals to the cows, a proportion of those cereals are sent for malting or milling, and they then buy in the byproduct back. So they're indirectly feeding those cows through the crops they're producing on farm, which is maximising the output of human edible food.
Yeah.
But also allowing them to use those byproducts, which are quite valuable feed components, in their house dairy system.
Okay.
They then they just about start taking the manure from those cows, and rather than putting it straight back onto the land, they're going to put it through an anaerobic digester.
Okay.
So that will diversify the business's portfolio in actually they're now producing milk, cereals and energy.
Yeah.
And still provide a valuable byproduct to go back into crop nutrition. But it's, in their case, I mean, it is for all intents and purposes an intensive business, but they're doing it in a way that is reducing the risk broadly across the business, and then maximising their contribution to food self-sufficiency.
And incredibly innovative as well, and partnering with sort of other businesses locally. Yeah. So yeah, it's really exciting actually what you can do with the right investment, the right will and the right ideas, isn't it?
Yeah. And even that business, they have a tenth of their land area in countryside stewardship, because they realised that although we have a broadly intensive system, there are certain land areas that just don't suit what we're doing. So they've taken those out, put those in to increase the biodiversity and the carbon sequestration on the farmed holding.
Yeah. And
focus their efforts on the land that is capable of reliably producing the outputs that they need.
Yeah, the right land for the right use.
Exactly.
So Jake, for the finisher, what would your advice to farmers be who are at this crossroads and considering both options?
You've got to really understand where your starting point is. If you're currently in a more intensive system, you're likely to have had to make a higher level of investment, which will generally carry with it a higher level of liabilities. If those repayments have got to be made, that could really limit your opportunity to move to a different system.
It's not so easy to.
So that, in that case, it might then mean that you've got to look at broader business restructuring before you then, as part of that system change. If you started from the more extensive side, I suppose you've really got to weigh up what your personal objectives are, and you've got to do a full holistic review of the business. How do we want to farm? Where are markets going? Where is the consumer trends? Do we want to go more into an intensive system? And the investment that's required with that, which might be needed if there is multiple people coming into the business for the next generation. The pie might need to be grown to be able to provide the opportunity for all of them. Alternatively, you might decide that it's better to continue with or further extensify the system and provide opportunities for those people coming into the business to look at alternatives, whether that be a further diversification of the business or even working off farm. It's something that people are quite scared to consider, I think, sometimes. You're not a proper farmer if you have another job.
Okay. That's fair. That's fair comment, isn't it? Okay. Right. Well, thank you so much. That's been a really fascinating conversation, Jake, and really appreciate your time. In the next edition of the podcast, we will be looking into succession, which is a hot topic at the moment. And we're certainly seeing a real focus on this from farmers who are going through the transition. And I will be joined by our Managing Director, Guy Coggrave, to look at some real examples of where succession has been taken forward really positively. Thank you for listening, and I look forward to seeing you again soon. Thank you.